Sunrise moved across my vineyard like it had something to apologize for. It crawled slow, golden, brushing the leaves with that soft glow that always made the land feel like it was waking up beneath my boots. I tightened the trellis wire along the south row, breathing in the quiet, the stillness, the scent of freshly cut vines. There's a reason I chose this place. This land answers to no one, not the county, not the noise of the world, and definitely not any HOA. That's why the moment I saw two dark shapes standing dead center among my Cabernet rows, the calm inside me folded into steel. Before anything else hits you, tell me one thing. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? At first, my eyes played tricks on me. The light blurred their outlines, made them look like shadows shaped into men. But shadows don't shift their stance like tactical units clearing corners. Shadows don't carry sidearms. Shadows don't stand with their legs braced like they've practiced a dozen times in front of a mirror. I stepped closer, letting the angle sharpen, and the image hit me like a punch to the ribs. Fake uniforms. Cheap navy fabric that tried to look official but sagged in all the wrong places. Plastic holsters strapped backward on their hips. And the stupidest patch I've ever seen, a pine tree printed like a child sticker above the words Lakeside Bluffs Community Enforcement Unit. Not police, not security, not anything except a bad idea stitched onto a sleeve. One of them lifted a clipboard as if paper could shield him from reality. The other shoved out his chest like that would make the fake badge shine any brighter. I froze them in my gaze, let them feel it. Because there's one thing you learn in federal work. People who fake authority always expose themselves before they speak. They didn't ask who I was. They didn't announce their purpose. They didn't even seem to realize whose land their boots were sinking into. But that's not even the half of it. Their mistake was bigger. Much bigger. I glanced around the rows, making sure no one else lurked in the vines. When I turned back, the tall one spoke, voice hollow and thin. "Routine perimeter inspection," he said. "Part of the HOA safety protocol." He tried to sound like a man who expected obedience. But I've heard men with real authority speak. I've heard commanders bark orders that vibrated the room. I've heard federal agents announce warrants with voices that cracked concrete. This sounded like a grocery store manager pretending he could shut down an airport. I asked him the simplest question possible. "What are you doing on my land?" I wanted to see how deep the delusion ran. His smile widened. He had the kind of smile that believes a rule book backs it up. He didn't realize yet that their jurisdiction ended long before my property line. Actually, it didn't end there at all, because my land has never belonged to Lakeside Bluffs. Not 5 years ago, not today, not ever. And the tall one's partner must have sensed my patience thinning, because he tapped the fake body cam strapped backward to his chest, like he thought the blinking red light made him look official. It only made him look incompetent. "Your property borders the community," the tall one said, "which grants us secondary jurisdiction." He said it like he was reading the words off a script someone forced him to memorize. Secondary jurisdiction. That was the nail in the coffin of my tolerance. I stepped forward one precise, slow step, the kind of step that doesn't need volume to create threat. "No," I said. "What you're doing is trespassing." My voice didn't rise. I don't yell when I'm serious. I narrow the world down to exactly what matters. The tall one blinked, breaking posture faster than a rookie in his first interrogation. I pointed toward the gravel drive. "Out!" The word dropped between us like a stone hitting water. No ripple. Just wait. The smaller man opened his mouth, probably ready to spit some line about compliance or safety codes. They always do. But I repeated it, slower, sharper, cold enough to cut the air. "Out!" That's when the shift happened. Their arrogance cracked. Their chest-thrusting theatrics dimmed. And just for a second, both of them understood something they should have known from the moment they stepped onto my soil. Authority isn't something you stitch onto a sleeve, it's something you become. They turned. Not quickly, not confidently. The walk of men who planned to return. They stepped off my land with muttered words about documentation and non-compliance. But I didn't turn away. I didn't even move. I watched them reach the road. I watched them pause to see if I'd look away first. I watched until they vanished behind the curve of the hill, and only then did I exhale. Trouble never announces itself with a bang. Not real trouble. It creeps. It lingers. It tests the edges. Men like those two aren't the problem. They're scouts. They're the first rattle in the grass before the snake moves. And as the sun rose higher, lighting the tops of the vines, a cold certainty settled in my chest. They didn't pick my land at random. They didn't stumble here. They came with purpose. The wrong purpose. And they walked away thinking they earned ground. But here's where everything blew apart. That night, when the vineyard was wrapped in shadow and the wind was barely a breath across the leaves, I saw it. A faint buzzing, a whine slicing the quiet. I stepped onto the porch, narrowed my eyes, and there it was, a drone hovering low, camera pointed straight at me. Same cheap brand Lakeside Bluffs uses for their community patrols. It dipped, scanned, hovered like a hungry insect that hadn't chosen its next target. That's when I understood the truth. Those two fake cops weren't the end of anything. They were the beginning. They didn't know it yet, but they had just kicked the wrong door. The drone drifted away into the dark like a metal mosquito that had just tasted something it didn't understand. I stood on my porch a long time after it vanished, hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the vineyard settle back into its natural silence. Most people would have felt fear in that moment. Maybe anger, maybe confusion. But what washed over me wasn't panic. It was memory. Old instincts stirring like wolves waking in the back of my mind. Instincts I'd trained years ago to stay quiet until I needed them. And tonight, for the first time since moving out here, I needed them. People in town think they know who I am. They think I'm just the quiet man who bought 12 acres of neglected vineyard, fixed the irrigation, rebuilt the winery, and keeps mostly to himself. They see a man who likes the soil, who works with his hands, who keeps to his land. They see calm. They see solitude. They see someone minding his own business in a place where people usually mind everyone else's. What they don't see, because I don't show it, is the life I had before the vines. A life built on discipline, precision, and the ability to walk into the thick of someone else's chaos without losing my breath. Before grapes, before soil, before sunrise rituals and the hum of drip lines, I worked cases that never made the news. I sat in rooms where guilt and lies mixed like smoke. I read people the way most folks read weather. Detectives aren't taught to survive pressure. They are shaped by it. I spent 21 years in federal investigation, 13 of those advising joint task operations for organized crime suppression, domestic fraud, and internal corruption monitoring. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because it matters. Men like those fake HOA cops didn't just trespass on a piece of land. They trespassed on the territory of a man trained to dismantle liars who hide behind badges, real or imagined. When I retired early, the agency handed me a medal, a handshake, and a reminder to enjoy the quiet life. I did. I earned it. But quiet doesn't erase experience. It just covers it with new routines. I learned to tend vines with the same discipline I once used to interrogate suspects. I catalog soil health the same way I used to document evidence, precise, careful, methodical. Everything in my vineyard has a place. Every row has its rhythm. Every tool has a story. I didn't leave behind authority. I simply redirected it. My land is orderly because my life is orderly. Neighbors eventually figured out that if something goes wrong, a dispute, a boundary question, a lost dog, a suspicious sound in the night, they can knock on my door. They know I'll answer with calm instead of panic. They've seen me diffuse arguments with a single sentence, settle petty fights with a raised eyebrow, and read a property map like it was a case file. Respect came slowly, but it came honestly. That's the thing about authority, real authority. You don't demand it, you become it. Which is why, when those two fake cops stood in my vineyard, I didn't just feel trespassed against, I felt insulted. When I bought my land, Lakeside Bluffs tried to absorb me into their HOA jurisdiction 3 separate times. Each attempt came dressed in polite language and pastel envelopes. For community cohesion. For safety alignment. For regional maintenance consistency. Every line was designed to look harmless, like a child trying to draw legal language with crayons. They wanted my vineyard because of its location, because annexing my land would allow them to manipulate county permits and inflate their community value. I filed every denial with notarized proof, stamped surveys, and property line declarations pulled directly from county GIS. Lakeside Bluffs never touched my land on paper again. But people who crave control don't stop at paper. My file cabinet holds more than wine labels and old utility bills. In the bottom drawer, I keep binders, federal case references, state statutes, property rights, private surveillance laws. I don't study them. I live them. When you spend years dealing with lawbreakers who hide behind technicalities, you learn every angle of those technicalities. So when the drone appeared over my vineyard, I didn't react like a man caught off guard. I reacted like an investigator who just received his first breadcrumb. Someone was pushing, testing, nudging the line. Someone believed enough of the HOA's nonsense jurisdiction fantasy to risk surveillance on private land. And only one group in this area is bold enough, stupid enough, and desperate enough to try something that reckless. I sat inside at my kitchen table, the old wooden one with scratches from pruning shears and a burn mark from a failed torch experiment. I poured a glass of my own Cabernet, the one aged 14 months in French oak, and stared at the land through the window. The moon washed the rows in silver, the vines swaying like soft shadows. That peaceful image was why I moved here, why I chose this life. Why I walked away from investigations and interrogations and crime scenes and stress that could crack a weaker spine. But quiet doesn't heal men like me. Order does, structure does, truth does. The drone wasn't an accident. It was reconnaissance. First came the fake cops. Now came surveillance. Someone at Lakeside Bluffs was escalating. Someone who misunderstood the difference between authority and arrogance. Someone who thought intimidation worked on a man who used to stare cartel enforcers in the face without blinking. That thought alone made something shift inside me. A hinge clicking back into place. A mindset reawakening. The vineyard wasn't just property. It was a boundary. My boundary. And no one crosses a man's boundary without earning consequences. I carried my wine glass down the hall to the office I rarely enter. The walls were lined with shelves of old case boxes, retired equipment, and locked drawers full of things I kept for reasons I never fully explained to anyone. I opened one drawer and pulled out a leather-bound folder, the one containing certified copies of my property survey, the original deed, the zoning classification, and the county's official annexation restrictions. These documents weren't for my peace of mind. They were for moments exactly like this. My land was designated agricultural production, independent of any housing association. Even the county recognized that the HOA's boundaries stop 400 yards short of my fence line. It wasn't ambiguity. It wasn't vague. It was law. Law backed by signatures, stamps, and the weight of the state, which meant every move those imposters made was a violation. Every step they took was unlawful. Every justification was built on fiction. And the moment someone builds power on fiction, it becomes my professional instinct to turn their fiction into an indictment. I stood there, flipping the papers slowly, feeling the old muscle memory flood back, the way I once built cases piece by piece, fact by fact, lie by lie, until guilt collapsed under the evidence. That skill didn't fade. It waited. It waited for this exact kind of stupidity. I set the papers down and looked at my reflection in the window. Older than I was when I started in the field. A little grayer, a little more scarred, but sharper, colder, more focused. I didn't leave my career because I was tired. I left because I'd seen enough battles. But this wasn't a battle I chose. It was a trespass into my sanctuary, and I don't allow chaos in my sanctuary. The next morning, the vineyard felt different. The breeze carried a tension I could feel beneath my boots. I walked the rows with a sharper gaze, noting every unfamiliar detail, every shift in the usual rhythm of the land. And just as I reached the western fence line, the truth hit me like a nail dropping into place. There, pressed into the dirt, faint but undeniable, was a footprint that didn't belong to me, or to any worker, or to anyone who should have been on this land. The soil around it was disturbed, fresh, the imprint deeper at the toe, meaning someone had leaned in to look at something, or plant something. I crouched slowly, ran my fingers through the disturbed dirt, and felt it. The pressure in the back of my skull, the recognition, the understanding. Someone had been here. Someone had walked into the heart of my vineyard. Someone had pushed past the first warning. Someone wanted a confrontation. As I stood, a calm settled over me, the same calm that precedes decisions I never walk back from. I looked down the length of my vineyard, the rows stretching toward the morning sun, and I made a promise out loud, to no one but the vines and the air. "I didn't start this," I said, "but I'll finish it." The wind caught the words, carried them across the rows, and for the first time since those fake cops stood on my land, I felt something settle in my chest. Control. This was no longer about annoyance, no longer about curiosity, no longer about irritation. This was the beginning of a case. And Lakeside Bluffs had no idea what kind of man they had just challenged. The footprint near my fence line wasn't a mistake. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't some wandering neighbor cutting across land they didn't understand. It was intention. And intention always has a source. I didn't rush to conclusions. I walked the perimeter twice, letting the morning light sharpen the ground, letting the details rise from the soil the way clues once rose off concrete floors in crime scenes. Every step, every shift of dirt, every snapped twig created a clearer picture. Someone from Lakeside Bluffs had crossed a line they weren't allowed to cross. And people who cross boundaries with confidence don't act alone. They move on orders. They move under leaders. They move under systems. Which meant if someone from that HOA stepped into my vineyard, it wasn't because they chose to. It was because someone higher up told them to. Lakeside Bluffs always pretended to be a premier lifestyle community, a glittering pocket of pastel homes wrapped in manicured landscaping and rules so suffocating that even the color of a garden hose required written approval. They advertised safety, harmony, and community. But I'd seen their meetings, watched their gestures, listened to their language. Harmony wasn't their goal. Control was. Order wasn't their priority. Obedience was. And no one embodied that warped philosophy more perfectly or more venomously than Karen Manning. Karen didn't just lead the HOA. She fed off it. She wielded power the way spoiled aristocrats used to wield land titles, without understanding the responsibility behind authority. Her hair sprayed into a helmet so rigid it would survive a tornado, her pearl necklace gleaming even in poorly lit community meetings. She walked through her neighborhood with the smug stride of someone convinced she had been chosen by fate to run a kingdom. She monitored trash bins like they were security threats. She issued fines for lawn length variations measured in inches. She banned decorative flags after one resident hung a novelty squirrel flag she claimed ruined the aesthetic integrity of the block. People didn't follow Karen because they respected her. They followed her because they feared the misery she could unleash when she didn't get her way. And Karen never liked my land. Not because she wanted grapes, not because she admired the vineyard, but because she couldn't control it. My property existed just outside her grasp, a reminder that her imaginary empire had limits. She'd tried, 3 separate times, to annex my land through perimeter realignment proposals. Each attempt crumbled the moment county zoning officials reminded her that agricultural property isn't candy you grab off a shelf. But to a control addict, a closed door doesn't mean stop. It means find a window. And Karen had found her window in the form of Greg Wallace. Greg was the kind of man who once had authority and couldn't survive losing it. Fired from the sheriff's department years earlier. Internal misconduct, intimidation complaints, evidence mismanagement, the whole rot. He landed in Lakeside Bluffs like a wounded wolf crawling into a cul-de-sac. Karen saw him not as a danger, but as an asset. She saw muscle. She saw compliance. She saw a badge, even if it wasn't real anymore. And most importantly, she saw a man hungry to feel important again. That hunger made Greg the perfect enforcer. Together, they built what the HOA called the Community Enforcement Unit. To residents, it looked like added security. To anyone with law enforcement experience, it looked like a poorly assembled cosplay militia. Matching Navy uniforms that weren't sanctioned by any agency. Radios tuned to private channels, off-brand cameras purchased from shady vendors, a white SUV retrofitted with yellow lights, a spotlight, and a decal meant to mimic a sheriff's crest. And beneath the surface, something uglier. Intimidation disguised as compliance checks. Harassment masked as community safety. Threats phrased as policy clarifications. The HOA under Karen and Greg didn't enforce rules. They enforced fear. I'd seen the signs long before the fake cops showed up on my land. I'd watched elderly couples shrink when Greg drove by. I'd seen teenagers pulled aside and interrogated about loitering. I'd heard stories of fines issued for invisible violations, window reflections, garden gnomes, seasonal lights placed at incorrect angles, whatever that meant. And each time someone tried to push back, the board circled them like vultures, drowning them in paperwork and hearings until people either complied or moved. Lakeside Bluffs called it community order. I called it organized harassment. The worst part was how seamlessly Karen manipulated her board. She kept them close, fed them half-truths, distributed selective information, and ensured they relied on her for every decision. The timid stayed quiet. The easily influenced became her mouthpieces. The ambitious became her lieutenants. And the fearful became tools. That's how she survived. That's how she expanded her power. But power attracts rot. And under Karen, the HOA decayed from inside. Funds misallocated. Votes rigged. Meetings updated after the fact. Security proposals passed without member consent. The community didn't notice because the changes came slow, creeping in like a fog. But I noticed. I noticed when Karen quietly approved an extended perimeter patrol initiative that expanded HOA monitoring zones into county easements. I noticed when Greg started driving his fake patrol SUV beyond the borders of lakeside bluffs, circling roads that legally didn't belong to them. I noticed when the HOA newsletter mentioned regional surveillance upgrades that had no corresponding permit filings at the county office. I noticed when 3 residents confided, quietly, nervously, that they felt watched in their own backyards. People whisper when they fear backlash. And in lakeside bluffs, backlash wasn't theoretical, and it was guaranteed. Which is why, when I saw that footprint, I didn't just see trespass. I saw escalation. I saw a system emboldened by corruption. I saw a hierarchy growing desperate for control, a hierarchy that needed my land to solidify its expansion, and a hierarchy that believed intimidation would soften me up for compliance. But here's where their mistake became fatal. They thought they were dealing with a man who didn't understand their structure. They thought I was isolated, unaware, unbothered. They thought I was just a vineyard owner with dirt under his nails and too much land to watch at once. They didn't know I had once dismantled networks like theirs from the inside out. They didn't know I'd read thousands of pages of behavioral patterns, power dynamics, internal corruption models, and governance manipulation tactics. They didn't know I had built cases against men far more dangerous than HOA bullies in fake uniforms. That simple oversight would cost them everything. Later that afternoon, as the sun climbed high enough to burn the dew off the leaves, my phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor 2 streets over, a woman named Rachel, who trusted me more than she trusted anyone on the HOA board. She'd snapped a picture from her living room window. In it, 2 men stood outside the HOA clubhouse, both wearing the same navy uniforms I'd seen in my vineyard. They weren't just standing. They were showing a photo to another board member. A photo of me. My face. My vineyard behind me. The image had clearly been printed from a security feed. Mine. That discovery cracked the final layer of restraint inside me. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't random. This was targeted. Greg and Karen had moved me onto their radar, and once someone decides you're a threat to their power, there are only 2 outcomes. You fold, or they fall. I knew which direction this was going the second I saw the photo. The HOA wasn't just a group of nosy neighbors. Under Karen and Greg, it had become a structure of abuse, a hierarchy of intimidation, a machine. And machines don't stop until someone tears out the wires. I took a long breath, letting the truth settle on my shoulders like a familiar weight. This wasn't about vineyards anymore. This wasn't about land. This wasn't even about the trespass that started it all. This was about power being abused in my direction. And for the first time, Lakeside Bluffs had targeted the wrong man. When I closed my phone, the vineyard stretched silent before me. A silent witness, a silent ally, a silent promise. The wind moved through the rows with a low rustle, almost as if the land itself sensed what was coming. A storm was building. Not theirs. Mine. The storm didn't hit all at once. It arrived in fragments, small, sharp details that didn't scream danger, but whispered it, the way a shifting floorboard whispers before a collapse. I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because of habit, but because something inside me was restless. Not fear, not anxiety, instinct. The kind that once pulled me out of bed in the middle of the night to recheck a case file, knowing deep down that a single overlooked detail could unravel months of work. Vineyard life made that instinct quieter, but it never disappeared. And today, it was louder than it had been in years. I walked the rows slowly, eyes scanning more than my hands worked. The vines still glistened with dew, the air still cool enough to sting the lungs. But something in the atmosphere had changed. The land was too still, too watchful, like the vineyard itself was bracing for impact. I followed that feeling to the western pole that marks the farthest edge of my boundary. And when I turned the corner, the breath I exhaled wasn't shock, but confirmation. There, drilled high into the utility pole, was a small black, outdoor-rated camera, perched like a mechanical crow staring down at my land. Industrial screws, weatherproof housing, cable stapled neatly down the pole with metal clips instead of plastic ones, a detail that told me whoever installed it didn't improvise. They planned. They organized. They executed with intention. I approached slowly, every step deliberate, studying its angle. It wasn't watching the road. It wasn't watching the HOA. It was watching me, my porch, my vineyard, my home. The sticker on the side was almost insulting in its obviousness. A pine tree, the same design on the fake cop's sleeves. Below it the words Lakeside Bluffs Community Oversight Initiative. Oversight. That word threaded through every abuse of authority I'd ever seen. Oversight was the justification tyrants used when they wanted to peer into places they had no right to be. Oversight was the language abusive bosses used when they micromanaged employees into exhaustion. Oversight was Greg and Karen's favorite shield, even though what they practiced wasn't oversight at all. It was surveillance, unauthorized, targeted, covert surveillance. I didn't touch the camera with my hands. I didn't yank it down. I pulled my phone from my pocket, zoomed in, and captured the serial number etched onto the bracket. Numbers manufacturers only use for registry and warranty. Evidence. Hard, traceable evidence. Then I changed my angle, stepped onto the lower fence rail, and photographed the cable trail. Whoever installed it tried to bury the line's end behind the pole, hoping no one would notice. They underestimated me. As I climbed down, a gust of wind rattled the tall trees near the property's edge. The leaves parted just enough for something metallic to catch the morning sun. A second camera, half hidden behind branches, small enough to be disguised as a wildlife unit. I stepped closer, and the truth hit me even harder. That camera wasn't pointed at the vineyard. It was pointed at my porch, directly at the seat where I drank my morning coffee. The positioning wasn't random. It was chosen. It was tested. Someone had watched long enough to know exactly where I sat each morning, exactly where my head tilted, exactly where I paused while sipping. The angle was too deliberate, the composition too precise. I didn't need a confession to know who installed it. The cheap brand, the sloppy attempt to hide it, the obvious oversight in angle correction. It was Greg's signature. Like every law enforcement wannabe, he mimicked tactics without understanding them. He tried to replicate real surveillance placement, but lacked the experience to do it right. A real cop knows to minimize blind spots. Greg placed cameras like a child building forts. More excitement than strategy. I stood under that second camera longer than I needed to. Longer than necessary. I stared directly into the lens, letting it see nothing but my face. Letting whoever watched feel the shift in power. Letting them sense that whatever game they thought they were running had just changed hands. Predators rely on the belief that they are unseen. Break that illusion, and you break their confidence. The third camera appeared later that afternoon, wrapped in a plastic wildlife shell that would fool anyone except someone who knew the difference between a deer trail device and a spy toy. Wildlife cameras face downward, angled toward ground-level movement. This one pointed level eye height, straight at the corner of my patio. 3 cameras, 3 angles, 3 deliberate placements that drew a perimeter around my life like a noose. 5 cameras in total would reveal themselves by the end of the week. 5 blinking eyes hiding in branches, corners, shadows, all installed with the same sloppy precision. Every one of them fed data somewhere. Every one of them broke the law. And every one of them belonged to Lakeside Bluffs. I didn't react with fury. That would have been useless. I reacted the only way I know how, methodically, quietly, with the kind of cold focus that once made criminals confess without realizing they were confessing. I documented everything: angles, times, serial numbers, weather patterns, cable paths. I collected the evidence the way I once collected proof in federal cases, building a timeline with enough precision to pierce through any defense. At night, I tested my own systems. Not for satisfaction, for certainty. I pulled up my router logs and watched as the familiar devices appeared: phone, tablet, irrigation server. And then, buried between them like a snake coiled under floorboards, was something else. A device with no name, no vendor tag, no ID, just a blank MAC signature. The first night I saw it, it connected for exactly 3 minutes at 2:14 a.m. The next night, 2:16. The next, 2:13. That pattern told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a hacker testing entry points at random. This was a hobbyist, a pretender, pinging for access with a cheap script Greg probably downloaded from a forum run by teenagers. He wasn't breaching yet. He was probing, watching, learning my system's reactions. I leaned back in my chair, letting the glow from the screen hit my face. I'd seen amateurs like Greg 1,000 times. Men who wanted the thrill of control without the discipline to earn it. Men who played hero in their heads while committing crimes in the real world. Men who believed if they pressed a button long enough, eventually a door would open. Greg was a fool, but a committed fool. And committed fools are dangerous. Inside the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind whispered over the vines. The vineyard, my sanctuary, had become a stage, but not for their show, not anymore. Every camera they installed, every ping they sent, every footprint they left was a breadcrumb leading me straight to the truth. And as every investigator learns, truth is a weapon. The next morning, while tightening a bracket on the irrigation line near the shed, I saw it again. Evidence waiting like a secret that wanted to be found. In the narrow gap between the camera housing and the shed panel was something wedged in halfway. A small black USB stick. No brand, no label. Just cheap plastic dusted at the edges. It didn't belong there. It wasn't part of the system. Someone had tried to plant it and failed to secure it. Amateurs always leave traces, always. I didn't touch it with my bare hands. I slipped a pen from my pocket, levered it out, and dropped it onto a clean cloth. Back inside, I powered up my old investigation laptop, the one without Wi-Fi, without Bluetooth, without any connection to the outside world. A fortress of a machine. Perfect for dealing with digital poison. I plugged in the USB. The screen flashed. A crude executable file appeared, its icon a sloppy imitation of professional surveillance software. I opened it carefully, peeling back the code layer by layer. Malware. Not sophisticated, not subtle, but dangerous to the untrained. It was designed to do 3 things: disable local camera feeds, reroute video to an external IP, and overwrite recordings. A perfect tool for staging false evidence, a perfect tool for fabricating crimes, a perfect tool for someone like Greg. I sat back, feeling a cold clarity wash over my mind. The trespass, the drones, the cameras, the probes, the planted USB, this wasn't harassment. This was construction. Construction of a narrative. Construction of a justification. construction of a case they wanted to build against me. Greg thought he could make me the villain his fake authority needed. He thought he could create a crime, plant evidence, harvest footage, spin a story, and walk into my vineyard with real officers behind him one day. He thought he could turn my land into his stage, his badge into something real, his fantasies into community power. He thought wrong. When I closed the laptop, everything inside me settled into place. Quiet, sharp, ready. They believed they were watching me. But in reality, they had revealed everything. Every weakness, every tactic, every attempt at power. I stood from the table and walked to the window. The vineyard stretched out before me, its symmetry perfect, its order unbroken. 5 cameras blinked somewhere out there. Somebody's eyes were watching through them. But the watchers weren't hunting prey. They were volunteering information. Every night they tried to observe me. I observed them back. I rested my hand lightly on the window frame and let the truth settle across the land like an evening shadow. The HOA had crossed a line. And now I had everything I needed to bury them with their own mistakes. Greg wanted control. But he had just handed me the evidence to destroy him. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was war. And I had just begun. War doesn't always arrive with roaring engines or flashing lights. Sometimes it begins with a knock, so soft you almost miss it. Sometimes it begins with a deputy clearing his throat in embarrassment. Sometimes it begins with paperwork so absurd you can't tell if you should laugh or start building a bunker. For me, the escalation began with the county sheriff's cruiser crunching slowly up my gravel drive 2 mornings after I found the USB. I was tightening the hinge on my workshop door when I saw the patrol car roll in at a pace so careful it bordered on apologetic. The deputy stepped out with his shoulders heavy, as if he already knew he was about to say something that made him look foolish. I didn't reach for anything. I didn't tense. I just watched him approach like a man watching weather he already predicted. He removed his hat, ran a hand down his jaw, and said, "We got a report about a possible weapons violation on the premises." His voice barely carried above the breeze. I stared at him for a long second, not because I didn't hear him, but because of how carefully he avoided looking me in the eye. "On my premises?" I asked. "Yes, sir," he said. Caller stated firearms were being stored in public view. He couldn't even finish without wincing. I led him to the workshop window and gestured inside. Across the room, bolted to the far wall, was my locked steel gun cabinet, visible only from a specific angle through the glass. He didn't even need to walk closer. One glance, and he sighed. "Yeah, that's not a violation at all." I nodded. He apologized. He walked back to his cruiser with the expression of a man forced into a losing game. He told me he hoped it wouldn't happen again. It happened again 48 hours later. This time, the complaint was about a strong alcohol odor drifting into the neighborhood. I almost asked him if the caller understood what a vineyard was, but I didn't mock him. He didn't deserve that. He stood in my driveway looking like a man being slowly tortured by paperwork. He scanned the horizon, smelling nothing except fresh air and distant fermentation. He pressed his fingertips into his forehead and muttered, "Somebody's messing with you." I nodded once. "I have a good guess who." He looked like he wanted to ask, but he didn't. He drove away slow, kicking up dust like an embarrassed dog burying its face. And just like that, the pattern revealed itself. This wasn't random harassment. This was a campaign. Someone, Greg obviously, was trying to build a complaint record, layer by layer, false report by false report. Each call was designed to establish a reputation, not a crime. A paper trail, a profile. They weren't trying to catch me. They were trying to brand me. They wanted the sheriff's office to start associating my address with problems. They wanted neighbors whispering. They wanted the HOA to plant the idea that I was unstable, non-compliant, difficult, dangerous. It was psychological groundwork. It was reputation assassination, and it was beyond sloppy. Days passed, and the escalation shifted from childish to calculated. I started noticing shadows where shadows shouldn't be, footprints near the fence where no one should be walking, HOA vehicles parked a little too long at the end of the road. Neighbors who usually waved suddenly avoided eye contact, their steps quickening when they passed my driveway. Something had changed. The story was spreading. Someone had poisoned the well. Flyers started showing up in my mailbox, printed warnings about agricultural hazards, vague references to community safety, accusations of non-compliant land practices, completely fabricated, deliberately ominous, anonymously written. I read them all, filed them in order, documented each one because harassment isn't just noise, it's evidence. And evidence builds cases. My old habits returned, sharp as glass. Times, dates, patterns, behaviors. The HOA wasn't poking me for annoyance anymore. They were constructing a framework, a justification for whatever they intended to do next. Karen's influence was written in every line. Greg's sloppiness was obvious in every tactic. They weren't working independently. They were working together. One brain, one ego, one obsession. Then came the knock that wasn't a knock at all. I was out by the arbor, trimming a branch that had grown heavier than usual, when I heard the soft, polite tapping from the front gate. Not firm, not authoritative, just too polite. Polite knocks are rarely polite. Polite knocks usually hide motives. I walked up the path slowly, letting my boots carry authority before my voice did. Standing outside the gate were two HOA volunteers, polo shirts, clipboards, strained smiles that looked practiced in a mirror. "Good morning," the woman chirped, her tone airy and artificially sweet. "We're conducting our routine environmental compliance review." I didn't say anything. Silence is a tool, and I've used it longer than people like her have been alive. She continued with forced cheeriness, trying to fill the space between us with words so light they nearly floated away. When she finished her rehearsed speech, I leaned against the gate and let the wind carry a moment of silence long enough to make both of them shift uncomfortably. "This property," I said finally, "is not part of Lakeside Bluffs." She smiled wider, as if she expected that line. "Yes, we're aware," she said. "However, due to adjacent ecological..." I raised a hand. "Stop." She froze mid-sentence. "You have 5 seconds to step off my property line and keep walking. At 6 seconds, I stop being polite." The man blinked. The woman swallowed. They stepped back without argument. They left faster than they arrived, their pastel polos fading into the distance like melting sorbet. But they weren't here to inspect anything. They were scouts. They came to test my boundaries. They came to measure my reaction. They got their answer. And just as the wind changes direction without warning, HOA pressure pivoted sharply. The next visitor wasn't polite. He wasn't cheerful. He wasn't pretending to be anything except exactly what he was: dangerous. I'd barely sat down with a cold glass of Sauvignon Blanc when a shadow crossed the porch, slow and heavy. The kind of shadow that belongs to a man who believes the world should move when he does. Greg Wallace stood on the sidewalk with his arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the dying sun, even though dusk had drained the color from the sky. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He wanted me to see him. He wanted me to know that everything the volunteers did, he watched. He wanted me to know he was the real force behind the harassment. "Your attitude," he finally said, "is causing problems." "For who?" I asked. "For the community." That community isn't mine. It affects you. No, I said. You're affecting me. The flare in his nostrils told the truth. Greg wasn't angry because of my land or my independence. He was angry because I wasn't afraid. Authority-drunk men like him crumble when they meet resistance they can't intimidate. He stepped closer, by inches. Still technically on public ground, but close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath beneath a layer of peppermint gum. These inspections, he said, they're going to keep happening until you cooperate. I don't cooperate with trespassers, I said, and you don't get to choose. He straightened, jaw tight, shoulders tensing like he was preparing for a command that never came. I lifted my glass slightly in a mock toast to his stupidity. Greg, I said, my voice low, even, deliberate. A man who thinks he has authority is one thing. A man who needs authority? That's something else entirely. The line struck him like a hammer. His lips pressed together so hard they whitened. He stepped backward, pointing at my land as if claiming it with his hand alone would make it so. We'll be back, he said, and next time it won't be volunteers. He stomped away, but I didn't watch his swagger. I watched the phone in his hand, the way he angled it toward his chest, the way his thumb hovered, the way he kept glancing down like he was receiving instructions. That was the moment everything tilted. Greg wasn't leading this operation. He was following someone else's orders. Karen's. The next shift came silently, slipped into my mailbox the way poison slips into a well. An envelope embossed with the HOA's gold-trimmed logo, addressed to me as if I were a resident under their control. I opened it slowly, carefully, already knowing it would be a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation. Karen Manning's signature gleamed at the bottom like she'd practiced it for hours. The letter stated that due to geographic adjacency and increased safety concerns, my vineyard had been provisionally designated within the Lakeside Bluffs expanded observation perimeter. Observation. The same word printed beneath the pine tree logo. The same word used by abusive administrations pretending their invasions were benevolent, not criminal. I didn't crumple the letter. I didn't curse. I didn't throw anything. I walked into my evidence room, placed the document in the growing stack, and poured myself another glass of wine. Because now, everything was clear. Every drone, every camera, every knock, every fake report, every volunteer visit, every stare. It wasn't random. It wasn't disorganized. It wasn't Greg's ego acting alone. It was a system, a structure, a coordinated effort. Greg wasn't the storm. He was the wind before the crack of thunder. And thunder was coming. But they had no idea how violent my storm would be. When I turned off the porch light that night, standing in the doorway with the vineyard stretching out in silver beneath the moon, I felt the shift like a blade settling into place. They wanted escalation. They had just earned it. Retaliation isn't rage. Rage is sloppy, loud, predictable. Retaliation, the real kind, the kind that ends empires, moves with precision. It arrives quietly, built on patience, on observation, on the simple truth that people who believe they're in control never see the moment it flips. Greg and Karen thought they were tightening a noose around my neck. They didn't realize they were handing me the rope and stepping onto the stool themselves. The night after the letter arrived, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the evidence I had collected. Camera photos, serial numbers, MAC logs, flyers, false complaints, neighbor testimonies, timestamps, an entire architecture of misconduct laid out like bones waiting to be assembled. None of it was loud. None of it was spectacular. But piece by piece, it formed a picture of an HOA losing its mind under the illusion of power. And every picture has a breaking point. All I had to do was find it, press on it, and let gravity do the rest. The first pressure point was digital. With the USB malware analyzed, mapped, and fully understood, I created a honeypot system, an irresistible decoy designed specifically for someone with Greg's ego. I isolated a dummy network, shaped it to mirror my camera feeds, then seeded it with exactly enough suspicious content to ignite Greg's imagination. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just ambiguous movements, shadowed shapes, and clipped conversations between me and my Vineyard assistant Toby about powders and moving crates before sunrise. It was acting, nothing more, nothing less. But Greg didn't want truth. He wanted a story to justify the authority he pretended he still had. The trap sprang the moment the device with the blank MAC signature connected for 13 minutes straight, far longer than the previous 3-minute probes. Someone wasn't just testing access now. Someone was watching. Someone was recording. Someone was convinced they had caught me in something, and that someone was predictable enough to move without thinking. He wasn't checking facts. He wasn't verifying context. He was preparing a raid in his head, a fake cop with a screen full of lies he believed were real. The next morning, before sunrise painted the rows of vines gold, I walked the perimeter again to confirm what I already suspected. 2 new cameras had been added overnight, positioned in angles that created a triangulated view of the shed. Greg was preparing for a climax, and I intended to let him reach it, with his own rope tightening around his throat every step of the way. But to dismantle an empire, you need more than evidence. You need witnesses, people inside the system who know its cracks, people who feel the pressure, people who see the rot. And fear, when directed toward them, makes men talk. I didn't solicit anything, I didn't knock on doors, and I didn't send messages. But pressure has a way of driving truth toward the person strong enough to hold it. That truth arrived late at night, in the form of a trembling shadow behind my side gate. A soft knock. A whisper of a man hiding from his own conscience. Travis. The shaky HOA volunteer from earlier, the one who looked like his polo shirt was wearing him, not the other way around. Sweat clung to his forehead, even though the night air was cold, and his hands twisted together like he was trying to wring the guilt out of his own fingers. I knew instantly he wasn't here to intimidate. He was here because the dam had cracked and the flood was coming. When I opened the gate, he stepped in like he was crossing into another country. "They're going too far," he said, voice thin, shaky, barely holding itself upright. I didn't interrupt him. Silence again. Silence works because people like Travis aren't used to being listened to. They're used to being ordered. He poured everything out. Greg's surveillance setup in his garage, the screens, the files, the notes about my visitors, the obsessive monitoring that Greg justified as community safety. Travis had seen it accidentally when dropping off paperwork, and what he saw terrified him. He told me about Karen, about the pressure she applied to keep the board quiet, about the way she approved budgets no one voted on, the way she funneled payments through fake consulting firms, the way Greg received unapproved bonuses so large the HOA accountant had begun to question them before being dismissed for performance inconsistencies. Travis spoke like a man vomiting poison, every word more frantic than the last. And then he handed me the folded piece of paper. A password. A login URL. A note. Internal cloud storage. Do not delete. Karen's private archive. The files she hoped no one would ever open. The files Greg used as leverage. The files that ran the HOA from the shadows. I didn't react with satisfaction. I reacted with precision. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, as if pressing the truth into something sharper. Travis trembled like a thread stretched too thin. He asked me to stop what was happening. He asked me to do something. He said I was the only one Greg couldn't intimidate. And he was right, but not for the reason he thought. Greg couldn't intimidate me because he was predictable, because I'd spent years dealing with men exactly like him, authority addicts whose incompetence was matched only by their desperation. Travis wasn't a hero. He wasn't brave, but fear pushed him into integrity. And integrity, even in small doses, is enough to collapse corruption. I sent him home with clear instructions. Act normal, speak to no one, pretend he'd never been here. Not for my protection, for his. Because the storm was nearly ready to break. 3 nights later, it did. The raid wasn't loud at first. It didn't begin with sirens. It didn't begin with shouting. It began with the flicker of headlights washing across the far rows of vines as 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled in. Behind them, a black tactical van crawled forward, heavy and slow, turning my driveway into a stage. I could feel the tension ripple through my guests. 12 friends gathered for a quiet evening barbecue under the arbor lights. Music stopped. Conversations froze. Even the vines seemed to quiet, as if nature itself sensed the fracture in the air. Officers poured out, hands hovering near weapons. Their formation was disciplined, cautious, almost overprepared. They moved as if expecting to uncover something violent, something criminal, something manufactured by the lies they'd been fed. A young officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his voice brittle. We received a tip about illegal alcohol sales and possible narcotics activity on the premises. Narcotics. The powder. The staged footage. The honeypot. Greg had bitten harder than I anticipated. And then he stepped out from the tactical van like a man finally receiving the applause he believed he deserved. Greg Wallace. Aviators on, shoulders pulled back, chest puffed like a parade rooster. He was vibrating with adrenaline, certain he had finally cornered me, certain his fake authority had evolved into real power. He shouted to the officers, pointing toward the covered barrels near my shed, the barrels I had intentionally placed there, the bags I had positioned, the exact containers I knew he had seen through the hacked feed. He lunged toward them like a child racing toward a prize. "It's in here," he screamed. "I saw him moving it. Open these bags." The officers hesitated, not because of fear, but because they sensed something didn't align. But Greg didn't notice. He was too drunk on the fantasy he had built. He ripped a box cutter from his belt, jammed the blade into the first bag, and sliced downward with all his strength. A cloud of white powder erupted like a volcanic blast straight into his face. He inhaled half of it, coughed, choked, stumbled. His head snapped back and forth like a man trying to shake off a nightmare. The powder clung to his hair, his shirt, his open mouth, turning him into a deranged snowman with rage instead of coal for eyes. "Careful, Greg," I said, stepping forward with calm so sharp it cut the air. "That's premium fermentation yeast. You breathe too much of it, and you'll grow mold in places you don't want to talk about." Laughter rippled through half the officers. The other half fought to hold it in. The young deputy looked like he wanted to sink into the gravel and disappear. But the real shift came when Andy arrived. Detective Morales. A man I trusted. A man who knew me. A man who didn't buy lies simply because someone shouted them. He looked at the barrels, the powder, the trembling officers, then at Greg, covered head to toe in the very substance he thought was drugs. "Greg," Andy said slowly, Where exactly did you see this footage you're talking about? Greg froze. What footage? Andy repeated. Greg stuttered. The footage from his property cameras. It slipped out before he could stop himself. And that was the collapse. The precise moment the rope snapped tight around his neck. Andy's eyes hardened. Greg, he said, his voice low and edged with quiet authority. How would you have access to his private security feed? Greg didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence convicted him. Within minutes, cuffs were on his wrists. His fantasy died under the red and blue lights. But justice wasn't satisfied yet. Karen was still hiding behind paperwork, behind signatures, behind the illusion of power. That would end soon. Because everything Greg had tried to hide, the cameras, the logs, the cloud files, the payment trails, was now in the hands of the state attorney, the sheriff's office, the county auditor, and soon every member of the HOA. Retaliation wasn't complete. But the machine had begun to collapse. And collapse always ends the same way. With the architects buried under the rubble they created. Victory doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in a courthouse hallway, carried in on the trembling footsteps of the guilty. Sometimes it settles overland like the morning sun, slow and steady, erasing the shadows left behind by men who mistook intimidation for authority. And sometimes, victory looks like vines swaying softly under a clean sky, free again, untouched, no longer under the eyes of people who thought surveillance was a substitute for power. That was the kind of victory waiting on the horizon. But first came the reckoning. Greg's arrest sent shockwaves through lakeside bluffs before sunrise had even touched the rooftops. Residents whispered. Car engines idled longer in driveways. Curtains twitched. The HOA pretended it was all a misunderstanding, a miscommunication involving an overzealous volunteer. But lies don't hold shape when truth is lifting its head. And truth was about to rupture the entire neighborhood like a fault line. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the dark hours assembling every piece of evidence Travis had given me, organizing the cloud files, compiling the financial trails, printing Greg's surveillance logs until the floor around me looked like a war room for a federal operation. Nothing about this was guesswork anymore. It was documented. It was archived. It was airtight. By the time dawn stretched across the Vineyard, I was already walking to the edge of the HOA boundary with a folding table, a stack of files, and a sign that read, HOA Safety, Update the Truth. I didn't need a megaphone. People came on their own. Joggers slowed mid-stride. Dog walkers paused. Cars rolled down their windows. Within 20 minutes, more than 40 residents crowded near the entrance, faces tense, expectant, bracing for what was coming. I stood tall behind the table, my voice carrying across the still morning air. Most of you saw the lights last night, I began. Most of you heard the rumors. So let's correct them. I lifted the first poster board, revealing a night vision photo Greg had secretly recorded from one of his illegal cameras. This one pointed directly into a neighbor's bedroom window. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Shoulders stiffened, eyes widened, fear curdled into outrage. This, I said, was taken 2 nights ago from a camera Greg installed without permits, without consent, and without your knowledge. Paid for by your HOA dues. The murmuring turned explosive. I flipped another board, showing the time-stamped footage from cameras hidden in trees, gutters, streetlights, places no one had thought to check. Greg didn't just surveil me, I said. He surveilled all of you. Your homes, your families, your privacy. Faces in the crowd changed. Shock fading into anger, anger hardening into fury. I let the silence stretch, let the truth settle deep. And Greg wasn't working alone. I held up the financial documents. Karen Manning's name glared across every signature line. "These are payments authorized by your HOA president," I said. "Vendors that don't exist. Overtime logs for Greg that were never approved by the board. Illegal cameras purchased with association money. And here," I raised the next page, "here is an email where Karen instructed Greg to find dirt on the winemaker so we can seize his land for the expansion." Someone shouted. Someone cursed. Someone else demanded Karen step outside. The HOA office blinds snapped shut, as if hiding behind thin plastic would stop what was coming. But the facade was already crumbling. The residents, for the first time in years, weren't afraid. They were furious. They wanted truth. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. By noon, 4 board members had resigned by email, swearing they had no idea what Karen was doing. By mid-afternoon, a news crew arrived from the nearest city. Cameras rolled, microphones pointed toward me, residents crowded in behind with phones raised high, and then, like a rat fleeing the sinking ship she created, Karen sprinted out the back door of the HOA office carrying boxes stacked to her chin. She didn't make it 5 feet before reporters swarmed her. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just watched as the queen finally realized the kingdom she ruled through fear was burning from the inside out. But justice isn't applause. Justice isn't spectacle. Justice happens in courtrooms where truth is weighed like gold. 3 weeks later, I walked into County Superior Court wearing a suit I hadn't touched in years, the kind that still held the echo of past cases, past victories, past scars. The trial lasted 21 days. Jury selection alone felt like a marathon. Greg's defense team tried to paint him as a misguided guardian, a man overwhelmed by concern for community safety. Karen's lawyers tried to portray her as a naive administrator, manipulated by her enforcer. But no lawyer, no argument, no theater can compete with evidence. When the prosecution played the footage from Greg's own garage, the recordings Travis captured secretly, the courtroom froze. The jury listened as Greg bragged in his own voice that once he planted the evidence, he'd get the winemaker off his land, so Karen could sell the vineyard frontage for HOA expansion. That recording cracked the case open like an egg hitting concrete. Karen cried through most of the trial. Not remorseful tears, strategic ones. But the forensic accountant was merciless. Line by line, she exposed every missing dollar, every double payment, every fraudulent vendor. The money Karen tried to siphon, the funds Greg pocketed, the kickbacks they buried. Each revelation hit the courtroom like a hammer. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't look at Greg. I didn't look at Karen. I looked directly at the jury. I told them about the surveillance, the intimidation, the drones, the camera angles pointed into private bedrooms. I told them what a home is supposed to be, a sanctuary, and how these two twisted it into a prison with HOA logos slapped across the cell door. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady, deliberate, final. On conspiracy to commit extortion, guilty. On aggravated stalking, guilty. On harassment, fraud, evidence tampering, illegal surveillance, weapons charges, guilty. 18 counts in total. Greg collapsed when the final count was read. Karen sobbed so loudly the judge ordered her removed from the courtroom until she could regain composure. But the real thunder came during sentencing. The judge stared down at Greg like she'd been waiting her whole career to meet a man this delusional. "You fabricated authority. You weaponized fear. You terrorized a community you were entrusted to protect. 24 years. No parole. Then she turned to Karen. You allowed a criminal to rule your community. You financed his operation with stolen dues. You attempted to seize property through intimidation. 18 years. Plus full restitution. The gavel struck like the final crack of a storm. Their reign was over. 2 days later, an emergency court order dissolved the entire Lakeside Bluffs HOA board. Every member removed, an independent trustee appointed, elections frozen, fear gone, control gone. The chains they had wrapped around an entire community, broken. 6 months passed before the silence returned to my vineyard. But it wasn't the heavy silence of surveillance. It was the clean silence of freedom. The cameras were gone. The drones were gone. The watchful eyes in the trees were gone. I walked the rows one morning, the sun warming the soil, and realized the land finally breathed again. Even the neighborhood changed. People waved now. They lingered. They laughed. Without Greg's SUV breathing down their necks, without Karen's emails landing like the grenades, the place became human again. Travis was elected HOA president unanimously, shaking as he accepted the role. He dismantled the entire enforcement committee his first day. Now the HOA worried about pool rules and flower beds, the way it should have been all along. When the Harvest Festival arrived, I drilled a new sign into my gate. Heavy oak, brass lettering. It read, "Private property cameras recording sheriff by appointment only, no HOA jurisdiction beyond this point." Not a warning, a declaration. That night, under the arbor lights, with neighbors gathered at long tables and bottles uncorked, I raised a glass and looked toward the road where Greg once prowled. The firelight flickered across familiar faces, faces finally unafraid. "To freedom," I said. "To boundaries. And to never letting small men play big cops." Glasses clinked, voices rose, laughter carried across the vines. I took a sip of my best vintage, deep and rich and earned. It tasted like victory.